Hello, JBS viewers. I'm David Harris, and welcome back to the ISGAP Hour. And as always, we open the show with a brief conversation with ISGAP's visionary founding director, Dr. Charles Small. And by the way, for those of you who are new to the show, ISGAP is not some mysterious acronym. It's the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. Hi, Charles.
Hi, nice to see you.
Charles, since we were last together, there have been some other important developments that I would call not just good outcomes, but outcomes linked to the work of ISGAP very directly, and which I find so unusual in today's world, where an organization can actually say, we were there at the beginning, we followed it through, and we're there to welcome the outcome. The President of the United States just signed an executive order that directly relates to one of the priorities of ISGAP. Explain it to our viewers.
So basically for the viewers, we take the best minds dealing with anti-Semitism, some of the best experts in academia and policy, to map and decode contemporary anti-Semitism, and we've been focusing on this project called Follow the Money, where we're showing how foreign money from the Muslim Brotherhood, from Qatar, has been influencing our best universities in the country. And we know, and we've been pushing this since 2012, that according to American law that's been on the books for many decades, Section 117 of this education...
Called the Higher Education Act.
Correct. It stipulates that any gift from a foreign entity of over $250,000 to a university, the university has to report it to the Department of Education. Any agreement, any contract, any MOU between a foreign entity and a university has to be transparent. Universities continue not to report. What President Trump did, and I think whether you support the Republicans or the Democrats...
This is not a partisan issue.
Yeah, this is the government enforcing legislation that exists, and President Trump, this administration, has been enforcing Section 117, calling on universities to adhere to the law, which is very important. And also what the current administration is doing is enforcing Title VI. Title VI forbids the federal government to fund any private or public institution or entity or corporation that discriminates. Everybody knows there's a very serious institutional form of anti-Semitism which is endemic at universities across the country. Some are worse than others. And clearly that universities that discriminate against Jewish students, faculty, or staff, the government cannot give money, according to Title VI, to these institutions. So the government is calling on these universities to adhere to federal law, and I think it's a big step in the right direction.
So I want JBS viewers to be clear. Those words, follow the money, are words you've probably heard, but they have an origin. And the origin began, as Charles said a moment ago, with the research that you launched some 13 or so years ago. And for many years you were there in the wilderness. People were not paying sufficient attention. But a law was adopted by the US government, and then it was ignored for too long. We now have a clear executive order that says there is a law, the law must be enforced. Right. And as Charles said, remember, Qatar, the Muslim Brotherhood, that whole universe, are the principal foreign funders of American higher education today. That's why this is so important. That's why the work of ISGAP continues to be frontline and so relevant. And as I said before to JBS viewers, that's why I chose to become involved with ISGAP, especially after October 7th, because our shared priority should not be output, but outcomes. Here is a demonstrable and important outcome. So Charles, thanks for all that hard work.
Thank you for all you're doing for ISGAP and for the Jewish community. Thanks.
Charles, I think it's time to welcome our guest.
Wonderful. We have a special guest today.
Yes, we do. JBS viewers, I'm especially thrilled to introduce you to, though I don't think she needs an introduction to most of you on JBS, to Professor Ruth Wisse. Yes, it's a name you know well, distinguished academic, longtime professor, first at McGill University and for some 3 decades at Harvard University, author of many books, the most recent of which I hope we'll focus on as well today. Frequently published in the Wall Street Journal and other major publications, with her strong views on the Jewish world, Israel, liberal democracy, the fate of the West. And I have to add that at this table, for this recording, I'm in the minority because Ruth is from Canada, my longtime partner and friend Charles Small is from Canada, and I'm the American at the table. Ruth, welcome to the ISGAP Hour.
Thank you so much. Very glad to be here.
We're thrilled to have you. I have to ask you, because in recent days there's been a Canadian election. Both of you are Canadian citizens. What's your reaction, Ruth?
Well, my reaction is very similar to that of a great many Canadians whom I know. It's one of great disappointment. Not surprise, because I think that everyone knew what was coming, but great disappointment because they had very much hoped for a change in the leadership of Canada to a conservative government. This is a surprise because, as Charles and I both know, Canadians who grew up when we did, everybody voted Liberal almost automatically, in the same way that a lot of Americans voted for the Democratic Party automatically. But this had changed over the years, especially as the Liberal Party became much more disappointing on the question of Israel, on many policies. In other words, as it kept slipping leftward, it left the Jews exposed in a way that they never had been before. And very slowly, but significantly, people began to change their minds. One of the members of my family was voting conservative for the first time in this election. And they knew how much was at stake for them and for the country. Because I think that all American Jews, like many all Canadian Jews, like American Jews, feel that what they stand for is not separable from what they stand for as citizens of this country. You see, it's not as if you think one way as a Jew and you think another way as a Canadian or an American. It has never been that way. So when people talk about, dual loyalties, this is a craziness from the point of view of almost everyone that I've ever known. It's doubled loyalties. You become a citizen of the country and you're very grateful for the freedom of the country and for its ability to let all its citizens live as they wish to and observe their own religion and don't feel threatened by multiplicity and don't feel threatened by coexistence. And then suddenly it begins to change, and the war against the Jews is allowed into the country. And then it depends very much which party stands up for the Jews in that fight, which we think is a fight for itself as well. You see, I am not, this seems very clear to me. I'm not sure it's equally clear to everyone else. But what is good for the Jews is usually good for every democracy, real democracy.
Well, we're going to probe that much more, Ruth, in the coming minutes. But just for our viewers, you yourself, together with your family, were actually admitted refugees to Canada in 1940. Am I correct?
Yes, yes, indeed. And here I have to invoke my father. We came miraculously. No Jews were allowed into Canada in 1940 when we arrived in October of 1940 from Europe. The book that covers that period is called None is Too Many, because that was the policy of Canada in those years. So we were about our family of my parents and my older brother and myself, 4 of, 200 and some odd Jews who were allowed into Canada in those years. Incredible. So when I began to think about these things, and when I saw the statistic one year of how few Jews were let into the country when we were, I said to my father, you know, you never let me say a bad word about Canada, but look at what Canada did to the Jews. It only let in, and I named the number that I had at my fingertips then, and he said, yes, but we were 4 of them. In other words, our gratitude to the country had to override what we knew of its history, and that our gratitude was going to be our attitude to the country, not what it did wrong in those years, but what it did right since then, you see, for us. It was a great lesson, and so I think that's what I mean in part about doubled loyalty. It would never have occurred to us to say that we are disappointed in Canada in the long run because of, you know, what it had done in the past.
And I have to say, Ruth, before turning to you, Charles, that your story so resonates with me because my mother arrived in the United States at the end of November 1941.
Wow.
And the rest, wherever you said Canada, I could say the United States. In terms of admittance of Jews.
Right.
And yet the overriding value in our home was everlasting gratitude to the United States, because my mother and 13 other members of my family were among those few who found refuge here and always taught me, love this country.
Yes.
We'll get back to Ruth in a moment, but Charles, the second Canadian at the table, your thoughts on the recent Canadian election?
Look, I think I'll echo what Ruth was saying. First of all, I want to say we're not just both Canadians, we're both from Montreal, which is very special.
But don't tell me about Montreal bagels, because I hear it all the time from my friends in Montreal. They're better than New York.
It's not even a question. No, but I think the Montreal Jewish community was very special. I think it still is to some extent.
Yes.
But growing up in Montreal, I have to first say, I first met Ruth as an undergraduate student at McGill, and some of the best courses I took was in Yiddish literature with Ruth. We used to debate and argue because I was coming from the left and Ruth wasn't.
Yes.
And through literature, we used to debate all sorts of things through Yiddish literature. But Montreal had, Ruth Wisse and Mordechai Richler and Leonard Cohen and Irving Layton, sort of a very vibrant intellectual environment, a very strong religious yeshiva environment, and the community was very connected to our Jewish culture and roots. There were a lot of survivors in Montreal, and then later refugees from North Africa, Sephardic Jews. So it was a very vibrant community. And I think, as Ruth was saying, the community by and large was, liberal for generations. But now there's been a transformation, and I would like to say that, I was for the Seders just a couple of weeks ago. I was in Montreal, and the first Seder was with my family. The second Seder was my sister had some friends over, and these friends were my grandparents were friends with a group of people. My parents were friends with the children.
Right.
I was friends with the grandchildren, and my nephews are friends with the great-grandchildren.
Oh.
So some of these families were around the Seder table, and they were discussing how they were taking their mezuzahs off the door. And these are proud, unassimilated, Zionist, connected Jewish people.
Wow.
And I have to say, in a way, I don't recognize the city, the country that I grew up in. The level of anti-Semitism, of radical Islam, of the Red-Green Alliance is shocking. And the question I have for Ruth, if I may, is, in a sense, from my perspective, and I don't know what you think, I had the privilege of going to Europe to study in the 80s and 90s, and I was seeing in Europe the sort of the reawakening of anti-Semitism, the demonization of Israel and Jewish peoplehood among intellectuals, but also starting on the streets. And the wave came to Canada, I'd say, about 10 years ago. And after October the 7th, it's arrived here. And I think Canada is maybe 5 years ahead of the United States in terms of the severity of anti-Semitism. So from your lens coming out of Montreal as a refugee and establishing your career there as an intellectual, and then coming to Harvard in the United States in the 1990s, and being here in post-October the 7th, given your roots in Montreal and in Canada, what would be your, I'd say, warning, or what would be your insights for the American Jewish community? What are the warning signs in Canada? Because I think we're really at a very dangerous point where violence is happening. For the American viewers of JBS, what would be your insights bringing the Montreal experience to the United States?
Well, again, I think that you've put it very, very well in terms of the slight lateness of the Jewish community of Canada in relation to America. So it's very interesting that usually one says that what happens in Canada is sort of 10 years behind in terms of Jewish acculturation, at least one generation later, because the Jewish large immigration to Canada came later than it did to the United States. It really became much greater once the United States closed its borders in the early 1920s. So the influences have gone in both directions. But what I would say is, first of all, the Jews are now a sovereign people. And our homeland, the homeland of the Jewish people, is the state of Israel. And it is my sense that Jews have no place to run to anymore. So if the idea was that you were in Europe even later and you thought, oh, it's time to leave, as many people did, leave France, for example, and come to Montreal, right? We had that influx too, not just from Morocco, but from France and from England. There were people coming to the United States saying, you know, I want to be a student in America and I want to become an American citizen because I don't want to raise my children in England. Well, there's no place to run to for the Jews anymore. This is very sobering. I don't think that we have assimilated that idea sufficiently. What does that mean for us? Well, it means that we have to take our political options much more seriously. We have to become more serious about politics. And the fact that we are, maybe primarily at this point in our lives, a political entity. It was very convenient for many hundreds and hundreds of years, many generations, to think that, well, Jews are also a religious community. And to put it crudely, we will live our lives as a religious community as deeply as we can, for as long as we can, as vigorously as we can. And what will be, will be. In other words, if we prove ourselves righteous to God, He will protect us. And if He doesn't, well, in some way or other, you know, we know that the eternity of Israel will always survive. We are an eternal people, we always will be. But we know that in each generation they come to destroy us. And God will rescue us from that fate. Well, we don't think that way anymore. We dare not think that way anymore. God's will is God's will. But we know enough to know that what God expects of us is that we do it ourselves. And that means primarily to do it in the political sphere, in the political realm. We have to get our politics right. Now, we are such a small minority that many people think, what does that mean? Does our vote really influence anyone? Can we really change the course of American politics? Well, first it begins, if you think the way we do, in the world of ideas. And the thing that you can influence is the world of ideas. So you had better understand the situation correctly, and you had better know, for example, to differentiate between the greater and the lesser evil. So let's say you have an election where there's no perfect candidate, as far as you're concerned. May I say that we have had such recent elections?
I can't imagine what you're thinking.
Oh, I know, nor can any of our,
Our
viewers, certainly. But it's still our obligation to say, wait a minute, what is better and what is worse? And it makes great sense to think of it as a Jew, because I cannot even think of the situation where you would come down differently as a Jew and as an American, or as a Jew and as a Canadian. I cannot think of a single instance where you would have to make that choice. That's how closely aligned the fate of the Jews in a democracy is with the fate of that democracy itself. So, that's the kind of that's the kind of initiative I would encourage.
Ruth, in the United States, we operate on the principle that whatever our party preferences might be, that we could count essentially on a bipartisan consensus about the U.S.-Israel relationship and the place of Jews in the United States. Obviously, there were distinctions between presidents, within parties, and between parties. Are we destined, in your view, in the United States and elsewhere, to now face this European pendulum swing, where one party is more pro-Israel, and proudly so, and one party is more hostile to Israel, and proudly so, and we simply have to endure the inevitable pendulum swings between parties?
Well,
Or can we somehow restore that notion of a bipartisan consensus, at least on the basics?
it's very interesting, and this is very important. You see, when we say that we expect bipartisanship, what does that mean? It doesn't mean to say that the Jews have to be bipartisan. No, it means that we expect the party
Yes.
to be pro-Jewish and pro-Israel. And when it is not, forget bipartisanship. They're not being bipartisan. In other words, it's not for me to vote Democratic because I believe that the country has to be bipartisan. It's for the Democratic Party
Correct.
to be as strongly pro-Israel as the Republican Party, so that both are equally bipartisan. You see what I mean? This confusion, you see what I mean by the confusion.
The risk, at least that I see, is that in many Western countries, we are in the process of losing or have already lost one of the major parties, which inevitably in the pendulum swing will either be in power or return to power. How do we grapple with that?
This is not our grappling. I'm sorry.
Okay.
That's what I mean by not being able to solve that problem. You solve it by stopping the forces that are trying to destroy the support for the Jews, which are the same forces that are trying to destroy support for this country. So if you are interested in this, you fight against those who are trying to destroy the support for Israel. What does it mean to be indifferent to whether you are on the side of the Zionists or the anti-Zionists? I'm quoting now from a thread among some of my most wonderful colleagues at Harvard, who are trying to do something now to change the culture of Harvard. So these are the best people. And yet I see on the thread, we have to be equally tolerant of the Zionists and the anti-Zionists. Exactly what you're saying. What? What is that? We have to be equally tolerant of those who believe that the Jews should live and those who believe that they should not and are dedicated to their destruction, because that's what it means to be an anti-Zionist. It means to destroy the Jewish people, period, right? You're supposed to say, oh yes, let's give both sides an equal hearing because that's what a liberal does. Well, this is insanity. And that kind of insanity, moral insanity, political insanity, has led to the situation that you have, where you have a strong anti-American constituency within these institutions trying to destroy America, but they won't say that they're against America. They say that they're against Israel, because that's a way of mobilizing an anti-capitalist, an anti-colonialist, an anti-whatever it is, an anti-American constituency.
So you touched on many important things, and as you were speaking, I was thinking of Elie Wiesel, who said famously that anti-Semitism begins with the Jewish people, but it never ends with the Jewish people, that it's an assault on human decency and democratic principles, and once it's unleashed, it knows no bounds. And you also said how we can influence the world of ideas, and this is a beautiful part of our Jewish legacy. On the battlefield of ideas in academia, you spoke of Harvard. There are professors at Harvard University on the task force of anti-Semitism that would argue that Israel's an apartheid state. Now, if Israel's an apartheid state, Israel, from a liberal human rights perspective, would have no right to exist. So it's not surprising that they have this sort of stance where they should support the Zionists, and that's their big liberalness, but also support the anti-Zionists. There's also, I think, I'm also coming from the left, but I have to say that the current administration has been strong and principled on combating anti-Semitism at universities. They're calling, for example, Title VI in the United States, it's illegal for the federal government to fund private or public institutions that discriminate. Clearly, there's horrible forms of anti-Semitism in many universities across the country, and the federal government is finally taking a stand, and now it's beginning to have an impact. But there's also a coming backlash among the liberals, some of them Jewish intellectuals, who are now arguing that the government is being heavy-handed and that they're entitled to this money, and it's the anti-liberal Trump administration with the Jews that are attacking liberal education, and that's going to be the next wave of attacking Jews. So how do you see this? We're getting it from the left.
Well, it's not, but you see, one is not getting it equally from both sides, as you yourself have just said, and there's a reason that some of us have changed our voting habits over the decades. It's not equal, and as I say, you have to distinguish between the lesser and the worse. It's never going to be all good, or sometimes, when you're very lucky, it all comes together. But in most democracies, you're always having to choose between lesser and greater evils. So that should not be difficult. And what I call this anti-Trumpism now, there's sort of, what you describe is sort of almost a relief. Oh, wow. Now we can be anti-Trump again. Now we can be anti-the right again. I can go back to my comfortable, sort of sphere because I can now attack him. You know what I call this? I call this pulling a McCarthy. Because I've seen this happen once in my lifetime, you see. There were communists in the United States of America. And may I say that this is an unresolved Jewish issue. There were tens of thousands of Jewish communists. They had children and children's children. And if you think that there are cults, political cults, you ain't seen nothing until you've seen the kids who grew up in communist families. This was also a joy of growing up in Montreal. We knew many of these kids, right? Now, what happened was that comes McCarthy, and his anti-communism is really too extreme for the country. It went against the law, actually. He was willing to push the law and to, in his war against the communists, which was perfectly legitimate and necessary, but he went too far, he overdid it, okay. Within 2 years, he was out. That is to say, the Congress itself outed him. Congress itself threw McCarthy out because he was not American enough for them. But what many of the Jews did and many of the leftists did was something very brilliant. Suddenly, forget about the communism. McCarthyism was the great evil. And ever since then, you never hear about what communism did to this country, about how it infiltrated the institutions, about how it infiltrated the government, about how its ideas of what was wrong about America began to take root in institutions. And you can see that You can see that everywhere. That was no longer there. All the movies that were made were about how awful McCarthyism was. The Front, these brave leftists who stood up, for Stalin. They never say that they stood up for Stalin, but that's who they were standing up for. So there was never a cheshbon hanefesh, you see. Right. There was never a self-accounting, if one may say so, within the Jewish community of what that was about. It was very convenient to turn against McCarthy. Why do I emphasize this now? Because it's exactly the same case. We all know the flaws of President Trump, and we know how easy it is, as you say, to flip from one side. At the moment, there is no flip. We know who are very strongly pro-Israel, pro-America, anti-isolationist. Actually, the party as a whole is anti-isolationist, although there are isolationist elements within it. So we know the difference. We know who is more for and who is more against. It's very easy to see that. So I don't like this idea of this trying to, make it so easy for ourselves to say, well, Trump is a, grave danger. We have to fight him. And how easy it has been for the universities now. There are 10 universities that are getting together to fight Trump. In all these years, they could not get together to fight the incursion of Islamism into their universities, which they knew was happening. That they could not get together to fight. But suddenly, to fight Trump, that is so convenient for everybody because, of course, most of the faculty of these universities, I don't tell you, are about 95% voting in one way. So it's a great convenience. And since we're speaking here within a Jewish context, that same convenience is a convenience of many Jewish organizations and many Jews within those organizations. It's a dangerous route. And I think that it has to be confronted honestly.
Charles, we still have plenty of time, thankfully, but I can already predict that we don't have enough time.
I agree. There's so many questions.
Boy, I mean, there's so much that you're saying to us and to the viewers, Ruth, and each comment triggers a whole set of thoughts. But to this point, I've heard you say elsewhere, maybe framed a little differently, but to the same point, it's very easy for us Jews to recognize the very real threats that come from the far right.
Right.
They march down the middle of the street, they shout, "Jews will not replace us." It couldn't be more obvious, recognizable, familiar in a way. But we have a lot more difficulty, you've been saying, if I heard you correctly,
yes,
in understanding the threat that comes from the far left, because it's not quite framed in the way of the far right. Have I heard you correctly?
Oh, of course.
And if so, could you sort of expand on that?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Okay, and if I may add a...
This is all unscripted, so
yeah, of course.
So bear with us.
So you've written many important books, and as David's asking the question, I'm thinking of your book that you wrote about 10 or 12 years ago, Jews in Power. And with the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in academia from the left, referring to your book, Jews in Power, how do you see this, I guess, post-October 7th threat coming from the intellectual spaces, the left, regarding David's question?
Yeah, well, so about the unscripted part, may I just say generally, in this kind of conversation, I love to watch these conversations. They're spontaneous and they're good because of that. But the truth is that everything that is said has to be qualified. So that's why one writes books. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because...
And we want to get to your latest book also.
Well, that's all right. It's not that self-advertisement in any way. But
people should be reading it.
Well, in Jews in Power, the question that I tried to answer, in part, was the question that you're asking, really. The question of why anti-Semitism works. Why has it become, to my mind, the most successful modern ideology and movement. Now that's a big statement, and people say, oh, you're crazy. What? What are you talking about? Anti-Semitism is the most successful ideology? Come on. Well, what I mean by anti-Semitism is not discrimination, hatred, all these things. I think this is, by the way, requires another conversation. What I mean very specifically is the organization of politics against the Jews. And the Jews are a very convenient vehicle for antiism. In other words, for the organization of politics against liberalism, against certain aspects of modernity. And the Jews represent all those aspects. And the interesting thing is that the Jews can be made to represent everything. So why is your question so significant? And that is because Hitler was defeated. It was the one form of anti-Semitism that was not just defeated, but it was defeated by the Allied powers. And it was defeated conclusively. And so in America, since 1945, if you want to portray a villain, and you want to be sure that you're not going to offend anyone, what do you dress him in? You dress him as a fascist, because that is villainy. And here is another point where we have not been careful. The Jews took their one opportunity to be on the Mall in Washington.
Right.
And, you know, this is an old subject of mine. And what did they do with that opportunity? They built a museum to the memorialization of the Holocaust. I call that a museum to the commemoration of the success of anti-Semitism and the failure of Jewish political strategy. Now, if it were called that, I would be all for it. Museum to the success of anti-Semitism and the failure of Jewish political strategy. That's what it shows. Great success. And you know, Eichmann thought it was. They wanted to rid Europe of the Jews, and they rid Europe of the Jews. What were we thinking as a people to come to the United States of America, and of all the stories we had to tell, we wanted to tell the story of how we were destroyed in such great numbers. Now, believe me, I know the other side, because I knew all these survivors, and I know how much pressure they want. They wanted their story told. They thought this thing had been hidden from view, so they had to bring it into the open. It's sad. I could make the case for the other side, but it is wrong. It is the wrong story. And if we were going to tell that story, at the middle of that story ought to have been, okay, yes, how did they get away with it? Well, what about the Mufti of Jerusalem? Why is he not there at the center of that story? The war against the Jews of Palestine was already full-blown. The Muslim Brotherhood had been created. The pogroms against the Jews of Palestine in 1929 were horrific, right? Horrific. And then he went to be with Hitler, to urge Hitler to continue that fight to the last Jewish child. That was part of the story. And what about the communists, who were also part of the story? Because in 1929, Stalin shifted gears. And Stalin, who had not been particularly, anti-Zionism was not the most prominent thing in communism until 1929. But in 1929, he said that the pogroms in Palestine were the beginning of the Arab Communist Revolution. So that red-green alliance that we see today, that's where it began. And the anti-Zionism of communism was ferocious. And all these slogans of anti-Zionism, that is their root. They come from the left. So when the Jews were dispersed, you had anti-Semitism against the Jews in dispersion. But as soon as Zionism began, you began to have anti-Zionism against the Jews as a people in their homeland. I mean, it's very clear. The shift did not come from nowhere. The shift came because the Jewish people changed its political nature. And so anti-Semitism very conveniently became the organization of politics on the left and from the Middle East, and those two forces united. And frankly, I have always felt that the most awful moment in modern Jewish history came on November 10th, 1975.
Right,
with the passage.
Zionism is
Yes,
racism,
yes, we have not paid enough attention to that.
which began in Moscow.
Which began in Moscow, but eagerly taken up by the Arabs. I mean, it was.
And according to Erwin Kotler, I remember at McGill, Kurt Waldheim, the Secretary General of the United Nations at that moment, a Nazi war criminal, we later find out,
Yes.
celebrated at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel with the countries that supported the racism, the Zionism.
Fantastic.
Yeah, wonderful.
Fantastic.
So you have the radical right, the radical left, and the
Yes.
Islamists coming into.
And,
It's amazing.
yeah, exactly. And in terms of what you were saying before, the bipartisanship, I would urge everyone to go back and read Daniel Patrick Moynihan's speech at the United Nations that day, calling it a day of infamy, you know, using the phrase that was used about Pearl Harbor, consciously using that phrase to say that what was being done at the UN that day was as bad as what was being done on the day of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, because he understood the connection between that.
And JBS viewers, for the younger JBS viewers, Daniel Patrick Moynihan at the time was the United States ambassador to the United Nations. Elsewhere in his life, he had been a Harvard professor for many years.
Yes, and
He was also a senator from New York, a Democrat.
absolutely.
You can tell by his name he was not a Jew. And as Ruth Wisse said, you need to read his speech, and then alongside it, read the speech of Chaim Herzog, who was then the Israeli ambassador to the UN, father of the current president, Isaac Herzog, and who famously tore up the speech from the podium of the UN General Assembly. So, Ruth, again, we keep coming back to the very same questions. Harvard, what happened?
And
Or let me frame it differently. One of my children went to an Ivy League university in the early 2000s as an undergraduate. And in our daily conversations, I'd always ask him about Jewish stuff and Israel stuff on campus. And he would always tell me for 4 years, Dad, nothing to worry about here. Jews are comfortable, Jews are safe, Jews have access, Jews are represented on the Board of Trustees, well defended by the administration. Fast forward exactly 20 years, and our ISGAP colleague has a son who enters the same university as a freshman, who has the same pro-Israel, proudly Jewish agenda, and who practically has to wear body armor since he arrived at Cornell in order to be proudly Jewish and to defend the state of Israel. Societally, what happened in those 20 years? I mean, you've seen it at Harvard. This is a different Ivy League university, but I suspect the explanations are not that different.
No.
And I should say that last week Ruth wrote a very important op-ed in the Wall Street Journal touching on these issues of what was going on at Harvard and the general malaise at universities.
Yeah, precisely. That is what I was trying to summarize, but you can see how difficult it is to summarize something that happens over the years. Well, there are many reasons, but what I tried to point out is that this is a continuum. It didn't happen suddenly, and it doesn't have to do primarily with the Jews. You know, as a matter of fact, I would try to make the point, you help me make it the best way one can. Anti-Semitism, I would say, is not about the Jews. It is about the organization of politics against the Jews. So what you have to look at is who is organizing it, what is in it for them, who are they, what do they want? And that's the thing. So I think that for me, it began when I came to Harvard and noticed things. The danger sign was the war against the Reserve Officer Training Corps. In other words, at Harvard and at many of these elite universities, ROTC was kept off campus, in the case of Harvard, for 40 years. Now, to me, this was inconceivable, you see, because the students who are at the universities, and at the best universities, these are precisely the years when you train for the military. I would say sometimes to students, look, I would love to go into the army and fight for the country. But, when you're my age, at that point, I was already in my 60s, they don't want me. And you know this from Israel so well, where every Israeli, of course, knows that at a certain age, where other kids are going into college, that's when they are going into the army. That's where people soldier from time immemorial and until time immemorial. That's when people soldier. So imagine what it said to all these students for 40 years now going on. You're too good to be in the military. This country is not worth fighting for. This country is so corrupt because it doesn't let in homosexuals, or because it doesn't do this, or because it doesn't do that. You're not going to fight for this. We're not going to allow them to recruit on this campus. Believe it or not, you're asking the question, that's where I would begin. With that kind of and many of these kids were red diaper babies, because what happens at a university, the people who push these policies are a small minority of the people on campus. First of all, they're all, within the Faculty of Arts usually, in the small, they're not the people who are, in the medical faculty or doing biochemistry, or, that's not where they're from. So it's very easy for any such determined group to push through its policies, and the university allows it to happen. And then other grievance groups came on board. And I tried in that article just to highlight the grievance groups. The women's grievance group, very important, and its nature underestimated. The black grievance group, the anti-capitalist grievance groups, and there was a Occupy Wall Street takeover of some of these universities that lasted for months, right? So this was not the first anti-movement on the campus over the years. But my point was this, that all these anti-movements, all these grievance and blame movements really had no target, no real target. What does it mean to be anti-Wall Street, or, I'm pro-feminist, anti-male, or what? It's too abstract. Then come the Palestinians, right? And they say, we're the aggrieved. We're the real aggrieved. We are the emblem of the grievance. And it's being funded, and it's being backed. And they plant their flag, and suddenly there's a flag, there's a uniform. Mm-hmm. And that's why that movement has become so powerful, because it has all that grievance energy behind it, and that's why it is so dangerous to the universities, which have not been doing their job. And just, I won't go on longer, but just to say that the opposite of that would have been reinforcing the good. That was the job of the university, and that's the job of Jews too, to reinforce who we are. That has to be done. It's not just against those who are against,
Which brings me to a quick question. You wrote a book a couple of years ago now called Free as a Jew.
Yes.
So does this touch on sort of your perspective of what we should be doing as a community, and could you expand on it? Like, what do you think, post-October 7th, with all the issues that we're discussing, how do we live free as Jews? What does it mean to be free as a Jew?
Well, I'm glad that you come back to this, because that is the note that we should always end on, if not begin on. We've spoken a lot about how to fight back and make sure that we win this very, very important contest for people's minds and hearts and political affiliation, right? But we do that because you also, at the same time, you have to educate your children to know why we are who we are, how great it is to be who we are. That has to have rich content. And I think that now there is a movement, I hope I know about this movement because I'm close to it, but I hope it is a growing movement, that people who did not think of sending their kids to Jewish day schools before are now much more serious about doing it. It's not about isolating us. It's about making sure that they know what they are expected to be and how blessed you are to have this inheritance. And it's the same for American students. You have to spend years teaching them how exceptional America is. They have to know that this is a miraculous political formation. It never existed before. It's taken millennia of human civilization to come up with a system of government like the system of government that America has, as Benjamin Franklin said, a republic if you can keep it, right? You have to appreciate that. So, what your mother wanted for you, what my father wanted for me, it doesn't come automatically. Democracy is not biologically transmitted. And Jews have always known how important that transmission is. We just have to teach that to our fellow citizens.
In other words, their Jewish education should not begin and end with a visit to the Holocaust Museum in Washington. I think is
thank you for putting it so succinctly.
Is part of what you're saying.
Right.
Is Harvard or the Harvards of America and the West, are they redeemable? Or, as Barry Weiss and others propose, we need new universities like the University of Austin over time to both compete with and perhaps even displace those established institutions?
Well, everything is in flux, and I think yes and yes. People make up their own minds. If there are enough people within these institutions, and no two schools are exactly the same. I understand that there are universities like Dartmouth where the fight is being won, and right, where they are not going under to these forces that are taking them over. And there are others where the leadership is not going to be strong enough, where the faculty is not going to be mobilized strongly enough, where they're not going to be able to get rid of the bad ideas that have driven out the good ideas. So I think that we have to articulate what the goal is, and many people have ideas as to how to reach that goal. But I think it's going to be fought on many fronts, and I don't think there's going to be one simple answer. I understand that there's nothing as glorious as setting up your own institution from scratch, and we've been part of that in our lives, and we know how it works and how wonderful it is and energizing it is. But it's also true that people over the years have invested a great deal in some of the great institutions, and before giving them up, it's worth shaking them up and making sure that if they can be redeemed from within, it should be done.
Good. Ruth, JBS viewers, we're recording this show on the eve of Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel's Independence Day. It's 77th in the reborn state of Israel. So maybe, even though this will be shown a few days later, Ruth, maybe we end this fascinating conversation with the thoughts of Ruth Wisse about the future of Israel. What do you see, and what does it mean to you?
Well, the greatest blessing of my life is that it has coincided with the birth of the State of Israel. And that will always be the greatest blessing of my life. I've been blessed in every conceivable way. but nothing as much as that. And in my book, Free as a Jew, I describe how, my 12th birthday was on the eve of the birth of the State of Israel. So I feel that...
So we also have to wish you a happy birthday.
Well, and so that coincidence of timing was most felicitous. But I do think that it's worth emphasizing to ourselves that it took millennia for us to adjust to living outside of the State of Israel. And in our schooling, I learned a lot about that because our teachers were very eager to tell us how amazing it was that the Jews could be destroyed in Jerusalem, but yet live on at Yavne and through the centuries and Spain and Vilna. And of course, this is what I teach, the culture of a diaspora Jewry, right? But now that one has returned to sovereignty, we can't afford to spend 2,000 years getting used to it. We have to understand the transformation of what it means to be a sovereign people responsible for that state. You have to transform teaching of Talmud, I think. You have to transform the teaching, you have to transform the liturgy, part of which has already been transformed. You have to start thinking very differently about the relation of Jews outside and inside the land of Israel, always thinking, yes, now we are a sovereign people, which means that no one dares question that sovereignty. You never allow anyone to question. The State of Israel is not contingent on the acceptance by anyone else or by any other people. See? It's not a question of, can I criticize the State of Israel? That's not it. You are not criticizing. You are blaming. And that is our number one priority, right? That we are a transformed people, and that's what we stand for.
Charles, I couldn't imagine a more powerful and poignant note on which to end this
I concur.
Thank you.
very special conversation. JBS viewers, you've just been treated to the wisdom, the thought-provoking ideas of Dr. Ruth Wisse, Professor Emeritus at Harvard University. Read her books, read her columns in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. We'll hope to have her back on the ISGAP Hour as well, but in the meantime, Ruth, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Charles. Thank you very much.
And on behalf of Charles Small, the visionary founder of ISGAP, and myself, David Harris, thanks for watching, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next week.